I ask John Martin to stand by, and I now call Pratik Butch from Chingford and Woodford Green.
Thank you. At conference, we're all in favour of evidence-based policy, aren't we? I mean, we're hardly going to raise our hands against it and say that we're either in favour of evidence-free policy based on prejudicial hunches and guesswork. So there is a consensus emerging that policy should be based on evidence. But where there's less agreement is on what constitutes evidence, how policymakers should gather said evidence, and how to put policies that stem from it into practice. And the point of this amendment that I tabled and that Julian's kindly taken as a drafting change is simply to highlight the commitment in the full paper to implementing policies based on evidence of the highest quality. There are some pretty positive indicators that this coalition government takes evidence and its place in policy making really quite seriously. The most obvious expression of this is a Cabinet Office paper that was recently published called Test, Learn, Adapt. It was written by members of the Behavioural Insights team, which we might sort of more likely to have come across as the Nudge Unit, and was written in collaboration with authors such as the medic and science writer Ben Goldacre. And that paper asks some very simple questions. What is the highest standard that we can set for what counts as evidence? How should we generate such evidence, and how should we interpret it? And what happens once policies based on it are implemented? And that test, learn and adapt approach is composed of three pretty distinct phases. Firstly, you robustly test a new policy, where possible, against current best practice. You analyse those tests rigorously and learn from them. And crucially, the last part is the most important bit in a way, you adapt public policy to ensure that the most effective ones are deployed. Now, the first two elements, the testing and the learning, do happen to some degree, but they happen in a fragmented and rather haphazard way. And the paper sets out a really robust framework for well-conducted policy trials that would actually generate useful data from which we can learn, based on the principles of the randomised controlled trial, which is widely used in clinical medicine, clinical science. Now, I've spent a decade in biomedical research. I've got a pretty similar PhD in a sense, those principles are therefore so second nature to me, but they're only just making themselves known to policymakers in think tanks and in Whitehall and in Parliament. There's a real piece of work that I'm sure Julian will lead to ensure that those principles are actually rolled out across the policy-making sphere. And it's an area in which there is some sort of cross-party buy-in, so it's something that parliamentarians and councillors should be able to work on. Now, of course, it's not necessary that all policies will be suited to the randomised controlled trials, and we ought to have a framework where we can generate and gather evidence in other ways. There may be some of you who are slightly worried about the impact of truly evidence-based policy on the place of values and beliefs in politics. Now, we're not looking here for sort of technocratic and managerialist government. What we're saying is that if our values say we want to raise educational attainment, okay, or we want people to live healthier lives, or to reduce the harm from drugs, we can test the different policy options available to us and employ the most effective ones. Of course, that's going to require a big culture change amongst politicians, amongst the press and the public. But if we pass this policy paper, we can become that change that we believe in. We can start that change. And I'm not going to have the time to talk to the other excellent elements of this paper, that ambitious uplift in science funding and the changes to immigration policy and science education. Other speakers have done that justice. But I just hope that we as conference do endorse not only this policy paper, but the work that follows from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we call John Martin, can I just check, John, could you just speak to Chris, our aide? I just want to make sure